David Carson stood in the doorway of his bedroom, watching two people on the bed having sex. One of the participants was his wife, Tori. It took him 30 seconds to realize that the other was Joe Benetti. David did not stay after finding out the identity of his wife's lover. He didn't get aroused or experience any of the other perverted reactions that he'd heard might occur if you caught your wife having sex with another man. He took the photo, then turned, went downstairs, and poured a triple shot of Jack Daniels into his favorite glass. He would make sure he got that glass in the divorce. He was irreplaceable. Now David knew why his wife didn't answer her phone when he called to tell her he was coming home early from a business trip. David saw her phone on the table in the living room, and the table was surrounded by a pile of clothes. What a fucking cliche it is to come home early and find your wife in bed with another man. The most interesting thing is that she cheated on him with that asshole braggart Benetti. Joe is the younger brother of one of the local serious men, and although the mob would never allow Joe into the inner or even outer sanctum, he still carried a bit of fame within him because of his brother, and Joe made sure that everything was taken care of. They knew this. David finished his whiskey and rummaged through the refrigerator for something to eat. It had been a busy day, and his last meal had been a carton of yogurt at the breakfast bar at the Marriott Hotel that morning. He found a takeout bag of chicken. Joe and Tori must have had dinner at Hunter's Lounge before returning for their dessert. Any uninitiated outsider might wonder why David was not so affected by his wife's adultery, but the simple fact was that David knew Tori was a slut when he married her 3 years ago. How many women do all the places have on the first date? She told him she was a different woman, and David had no reason to doubt her fidelity until that evening. So maybe people really can't change themselves. Another fact is that David is tired of all the drama surrounding his marriage to Tori. The woman could get angry over the smallest thing, and David recently considered simply divorcing her. At least now he had a decent excuse and could leave with a clear conscience and perhaps most of his property. David finished his cold chicken and his second triple whiskey and was about to leave when Tori came into the kitchen and started screaming. "David! What the heck? What are you doing here?" David had to stop himself from laughing at his wife, but he answered her directly. "Live here." Just at that moment, Joe ran into the room. He was completely naked, and in his hand, he was holding a lamp from David's bedside table. He noticed David and stopped abruptly. "David, what the fuck are you doing here? Live here." Joe had always had the ability of a third grader, and he apparently interpreted David's reticent response as fear. "Okay, cuckold, get the hell out of here before I punish you. Your old lady and I have some unfinished business." Joe waved the lamp above his head, shouting his warning. David decided he'd had enough. On the kitchen table lay an expensive set of knives that his aunt and uncle had given the couple as a wedding gift. Perhaps the whiskey had clouded his judgment. He could leave the kitchen or... He looked at the knives again and considered his options. Having never done anything like this, he chose a long carving knife that he had last used when they hosted his relatives for Thanksgiving. None of the 3 people in the room realized what happened until after it happened. David plunged the knife into Joe's stomach. The horror in Joe's eyes was unreal. David looked into those eyes. He had never killed a person before. Heck, his last fist fight was in elementary school. When David looked into those eyes, he wondered, what was Joe thinking? Did Joe know he would die within minutes? Was he thinking about his miserable life or about the wife and son he would never see again? As Joe collapsed to the ground, David realized that those last moments of consciousness had been lost to the ether. No one will ever know Joe's last thoughts. As Joe's body hit the floor, Tori began screaming. David did something else he had never thought of before. He hit Tori right in the nose and knocked her out, hitting a woman for the first time in her life. The gravity of what had just happened sobered David. He looked at Joe, then at his wife. David knew he had just signed his own death warrant. Joe's brother John would have him killed for this, and he knew the killing would not be quick or painless. John Benetti had a reputation to uphold, and David would serve as another example that no one messes with Benetti. He looked at his wife lying unconscious on the floor next to the dead man. He almost shouted out loud, "Damn it, Torre, why the hell did you want to have sex with Benetti?" Now relatively sober, David considered what to do. He carried her to the bed, tied her with several of his silk ties, and inserted a gag into her mouth. Then he went into the office to turn on his computer. Are there any restrictions on the information that exists on the internet? David opened the Bing web page. Someone at work once said that Google was tracking all searches, and whether that information was true or not, the last thing he wanted was for someone to track his internet searches tonight. He typed, "How to disappear." Several articles appeared, and he studied them, taking detailed notes. Other queries provided more information. By 4 in the morning, he had a plan. He checked on Tori. She struggled against her bonds, but didn't seem to be in too much pain. He lay down on the bed in the guest room and snatched a few hours of sleep. When David woke up at 8, he untied Tori and let her go to the toilet without removing the gag from her mouth. He briefly considered asking her why, but thought she would simply take the opportunity to blame him or come up with some other lame excuse. He tied her back to the bed and whispered in her ear, "Just sit still for a while. Sorry, but I'm not going to die because you decided to have sex with some asshole. I'll call someone tomorrow and let them know where you are. You'll have 24 hours of discomfort, and I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Goodbye." David looked at this woman for the last time. Later, he will try to understand what made him marry her in the first place. How could he be so stupid? Right now, he was more concerned with the list of things he needed to accomplish before becoming a shadow. At the top of the list were the steps required to obtain the largest amount of money from his various sources and get those funds out of the country without being stopped by the authorities. Cash advances on credit cards, getting money from his investments, tapping into his net worth line. Will the surge in activity cause anxiety? Not if done correctly, according to what his online resources suggested. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, David had 100,000 and a first-class ticket to Rome. From Rome, he will take advantage of new European Union rules and take refuge in one of the small semi-autonomous regions where there is little surveillance of foreigners. Karen Roland sat at her desk in her office, trying to figure out a way to tell her client, without completely destroying the woman, that the client's husband was having sex with his secretary. From their previous conversations, Karen knew that the client loved her husband. Too bad she was married to shit. Concentrating on her terminal, Karen heard the outer door to the office open. Her administrative assistant went to lunch and left again without locking the outside door. Karen glanced at the prosthetic leg standing in the corner. The damn thing was bothering her again and needed another tune-up. Karen wondered if she would be able to secure it to her knee joint in time. Bad luck. The door to her office opened immediately after she heard a male voice calling out to her, "Can I?" The man stuck his head through the door. Not a bad guy, most likely Southern European. He smiled, but in that smile there was only a hint that it was only for show when he spoke. The door was open. "Is it okay that I bothered you? I have a man to find." Karen saved her work on the computer and motioned for the stranger to enter. Without getting up, she extended her hand and introduced herself. "Karen Roland, how can I help you?" The stranger took her hand and held it for too long. Was this done to seduce or intimidate her? "My name is John Benetti. My sister, Tori Carson, is trying to find her wayward husband. He practically destroyed their accounts and left the country. We know that last year he flew to Rome. She believes that he should know that she gave birth to his child. Personally, I think it's better for her to raise the child alone, but how can you argue with the mother? We have hired 2 different agencies in the last year and both failed. I learned your name from a friend. Anyway, she keeps asking me to help find him, and I keep trying." His name is David Carson. John Benetti's story did not immediately raise alarm bells. She told him about the difficulty of finding anyone in Europe, but that it was not impossible. She had the contacts and resources to make it happen. She also discussed fees and estimated costs. Benetti never flinched at this. "Can I meet your sister?" "Certainly. I can invite her here today or tomorrow." "At what time?" "If you can come tomorrow morning at 9 with Mrs. Carson, I will prepare the contracts for your signature. She will need to answer a few questions for reference." Benetti left. It's funny. He must have seen her leg in the corner, but he didn't react. Karen did not ponder the matter any further and returned to the report for her client. At 9 the next morning, John Benetti returned to the private investigator's office with Mrs. Tori Carson. Karen immediately noticed two things. Mrs. Carson had once been hit on the nose so hard that it broke, and Mrs. Carson looked scared, maybe a battered wife. Why did these women always want their abusive husbands to come back? Couldn't they understand how much better off they would be without worrying about getting hit? Karen asked questions. "Has your husband been to Europe before? Where and when? Did he like any particular city or region? Does he know any foreign languages?" Mrs. Carson answered these and other questions conscientiously, but as the three of them talked, Karen reconsidered her initial suspicions. It wasn't her husband that Mrs. Carson was afraid of. She was afraid of her brother, John Benetti. Karen seriously considered turning down the assignment, but Karen needed the money and, against her better judgment, had Mrs. Carson sign the contract. Karen's husband, Bill, was in the hospital fighting for his life. How did a 35-year-old man who had never been sick in his life develop cancer? Although Bill had decent insurance and his company paid half his salary during his struggle to survive, the Roland family struggled financially. Karen needed this contract to pay the bills. The contract was signed and John Benetti wrote a check for the deposit. Karen wanted to make inquiries about Benetti and Carson, but she would have to do it without the usual help. All her contacts in the NYPD have dried up. Recently, several officers were fired for making unauthorized queries to various criminal databases. The officers lost their jobs and most of their pensions. Every detective agency in the city was now howling without the means to obtain this kind of inside information, and a number of police officers had lost a good increase in their salaries. The city caught and fired only a handful of officers who provided this service, but everyone got the point. Karen will have to wait until Hank returns from overseas this weekend before she can get any details. Hank had retired from a prominent intelligence agency and was currently working for a private intelligence contractor. Hank's offshore contacts would have helped find Mr. Carson if David Carson had not already snuck back into the country. Karen immediately began making inquiries on her own. Social networks, newspaper articles. By the time Hank returned on Friday, Karen's own research had provided enough information to make her worried. David Carson was wanted in connection with the murder of one Joseph Benetti. Joseph Benetti's obituary did not mention a sister named Tori Carson, but John was named as a brother. John Benetti was once charged with racketeering in the 1990s, but was never convicted. A newspaper article covering the trial stated that Benetti was rumored to be a member of the Gambino crime family. However, it sounded as if David Carson was a criminal, even if he wasn't convicted of a crime, and Karen needed the money. David Carson woke up as the sun streamed through the southeast window. Sunlight wasn't the only thing shining through. The sound of dozens of diesel engines filled his ears as fishing boats left the harbor. David got up, went to the toilet, and dried himself with a towel. Returning to the bedroom of the studio apartment, David looked at the sleeping beauty in his bed before turning on the coffee pot. He sat on the bed, reading a paperback book, while waiting for the coffee to brew. When he heard the blonde's breathing change, he reached out to rub her back. Lisa opened her eyes, and a smile appeared on her face. "Do I smell coffee?" "Yes. Are you ready for a cup?" "Maybe in a minute. Did you happen to clean up after yesterday?" David knew exactly what Lisa meant. "Yes. I washed myself after taking a leak." Lisa turned over and, without wasting a second, began to please David's manhood. She quickly brought him to the desired goal and then said, "This is payback for all the climaxes you gave me last night. Now please pour me a cup of coffee. David found himself in this sleepy fishing village 2 weeks after landing in Rome on that fateful day last year. His cost of living was modest. He made $100,000 from odd jobs in the village, including the fact that he was one of the few people in the city who knew Windows. A number of businesses in the city and throughout the province needed computer support, and David provided it in cash or barter. Since no one ever asked for his passport, David posed as a Canadian from Ontario and changed his name to John Davis, close enough to David that he would always respond to him, even when he was drunk. After 6 months of voluntary abstinence, watching his wife having fun with this bastard had undermined his self-esteem. One evening, in a bar where most of the foreigners hung out, David, now Davis, was approached by a pretty blonde. Lisa Walker was an Australian touring Europe after graduating from the University of Sydney, where she majored in physiology and spent 4 years on the university volleyball team. Her first year after graduation was spent earning a place on the Australian Olympic beach volleyball team. Having failed in this, Lisa ended up in Catalonia via Ibiza. Lisa had noticed the quiet, handsome man on 2 previous occasions and decided that this evening she would introduce herself. Within 10 minutes, Lisa knew his name was John Davis. He was Canadian, and she knew she would sleep with him before the end of the night. She slept with him, and it was fucking fantastic. What Lisa didn't know was that Davis had spent the last couple of months of abstinence trying to figure out what went wrong with his last sexual relationship. Why did Tori feel the need to move beyond their marriage? Whatever the reason, the bell is guaranteed to ring for the next woman. And Lisa became the happy owner of all this research. Never in her life had she reached the finish line so many times in one night. It was so good that she came back the next night for a repeat. 4 months later, Davis and Lisa were still dating, still exclusive, and still enjoying sex. Davis even thought about asking Lisa to move in with him. In the end, it took Karen and Hank 2 weeks to find David Carson in Catalonia. But during those 2 weeks, Karen's conscience began to bother her so much that she decided to return the money to Benetti. She called and asked if he could come to the office the next day. When Benetti arrived, Karen declared that it was a lost cause. Carson might even be dead. She handed Benetti a check minus her expenses and told him she had failed. Benetti took the check, but something about the exchange left Karine with an unpleasant feeling. 2 days later, Karine was leaving the office just in time to meet the children when they returned home from school. Bill had been released from the hospital and was doing his best to help around the house, but he had chemotherapy this morning, which meant he would be too sick to cook dinner. It was a typical rough night after chemotherapy for him. As Karen approached the metro station, a black SUV pulled up next to her. The back door opened and John Benetti stared at Karen, pointing a gun at her. "Sit down." Karen was going to try to escape. Even with a prosthetic leg, she could move better than most people thought, but she saw something in the car that made her stop. Her daughter Hannah sat in the seat next to Benetti. Karen gave up and got into the car. "I know you found something. I think it's in your daughter's best interest to give this to me. And if I do this, what kind of insurance will I get if you let us go?" "None, but I will let you go if you give me what I want. If you don't do this, I guarantee that this little girl will die, but not before I turn her into a woman. She is 13. You can't be such an animal. Test me and find out. Here we are in your office building. Get up, take what you found, and I'll forget it all. Just remember, if you call the police, the little girl will die. You have exactly 2 minutes before I leave here." Karen couldn't risk it. She took the elevator up, trying to figure out if she had any options. With so little time, she couldn't think of anything that wouldn't jeopardize Hannah's safety. "What the hell?" she thought to herself. Considering how Carson killed Joseph, now John wants to kill Carson. If these idiots want to kill each other, I'm not going to stop them at the risk of losing Hannah. Karen took the report and returned to the car. When Karen handed the report to Benetti, he opened it, read it quickly, and then turned to Karen. "Well done. 2 other detective agencies never found the son of a bitch, even though it took months. You did it in 2 weeks. And one more thing. If anyone alerts Carson that we know where he is, Hannah will come with us a second time. No warnings. She will just disappear one day. Do we understand each other?" In response, Karen nodded, took Hannah's hand, and got out of the car. John Bonetti just made the biggest mistake of his miserable life. 14 years before this incident, Karen Rowland was Karen Baker and worked in the intelligence division of the New York Police Department. Karen interacted with agents from other intelligence agencies, including a man we'll call Hank. There was chemistry between them. Not only did they have a deep respect for each other's work abilities, both mental and physical, but over the course of 5 months of working together, an attraction developed between them. This attraction resulted in a love affair that lasted several months until they both realized the difficulties of continuing the affair. Both knew it was temporary. Hank will soon leave for the Middle East, and their romance never develops into anything more than friendship and great sex. There was one more problem that needed to be solved. Karen's diaphragm obviously didn't do its job. Karen was pregnant. The pregnancy was confirmed a week before Hank left for Afghanistan. They discussed this and decided that Hank would continue his departure and send Karen an appropriate amount each month for child support. They would discuss it again after Hank returned from overseas. Karen was pleased with this decision. She wanted this child and was happy that the child would have great genes. She understood the difficulties she faced as a single mother, but at least she was financially secure. Then something happened that changed everything. Karen was 7 months pregnant and was walking up the stairs of a subway station on her way to work when she tripped and nearly fell down the stairs, but her fall was caught by a man standing behind her. As she was helped up, she found herself in the arms of the largest man she had ever known. "Thank you. I think you just saved me from a very nasty fall. Please, this cannot happen to a woman with a child on board. Let me carry your briefcase." "Where are you going?" Karen told him and introduced herself. "I'm Bill Rowland. You hurry? Can I buy you a cup of coffee or something?" Karen agreed to coffee, then dinner that weekend, then to the theater the following week, and so on, until she even agreed to let Bill be her partner in pregnancy classes, explaining to her sister the reason for changing trainers. Karen realized that this was the one. But would he agree to raise someone else's child? This is not how most men wanted their marriage to start, raising another man's child. Hannah was 2 months old when their relationship became serious. Karen and Bill sat down and talked. Bill started with what was on his mind. "Karen, I have 2 questions. First, how many children do you want? I always hoped for 2 or 3. Why do you ask? Because I would like to have my own child. I needed to know if Hannah would be your only child." "Bill, I love Hannah with all my heart, but I would like to have a child with my husband. Is this the answer to your first question?" Bill smiled. This would be a major stumbling block for their future. "Second question, what happens when Hank returns? You will have a child with him. Loyalty is non-negotiable. I'm not going to share my wife with another man." Karen answered honestly. "Me too. Giving up everyone else is a vow I intend to keep and want my husband to keep." Bill's smile widened. Now it's Karen's turn. "Okay, you asked, and I answered 2 of your questions. Now I have 2 of my own. First of all, Hank and I discussed this recently. He won't be back for a long time, at least for a couple of years. And to be honest, he's not very fit to be a father. Can you raise Hannah as your own? No favorites if we have 1 or 2 children of our own?" Hank has already agreed to the adoption, although I think he wants to meet you first, before it becomes official. "I've thought about this a lot, Karen. Yes, if you want me to take on the role of her father, I want it. You know I already love this little girl." Now it was Karen's turn to smile. "One more thing I need to know. Hank said he would allow the adoption, but he would like to take on the role of uncle. Can you handle my ex-lover being here from time to time? Remember, I have already given you my word of fidelity." Bill thought for a moment before answering. "Until you start using Hank as a surrogate when we have problems in the future. My brother Tony's wife had a friend who turned into a lover when she and Tony started having some problems. I'm saying that if you have problems in your marriage, the husband and wife discuss them, not some unqualified third party. Or worse, someone whose actual plans may not be in the best interests of the couple. Agree? Agree. Now that this is over, Bill pulled a ring out of his pocket. Karen, will you marry me? Karen was shocked, not expecting it so soon after the talk, but she maintained her composure long enough to say yes and give Bill the most romantic kiss of his life. So Bill became Dad, and Hank became Uncle Hank. They would tell Hannah the details much later. A year after the wedding, Anthony was born. Anthony was only 2 years old when Karen was shot, lost her leg, and was discharged from the police department on disability. When Karen opened her own detective agency, she found it necessary to use Hank's knowledge and contacts from time to time. By this time, Bill and Hank were good friends, almost like brothers. Both men understood the other's honesty. Hank trusted Bill to protect and love Hannah. Bill trusted Hank to respect his marriage to Karen. It was the morning after Hannah was kidnapped, and Karen took the day off from work. She needed to talk to Bill, and she knew he wouldn't have enough energy until lunch. Bill knew something was up and waited for it to open. He also knew that she was waiting for him to be decisive before starting any conversation. They finished a nice lunch, and Bill did his best to look ready. He assumed this was another discussion about their finances. "Okay, Karen, what do we need to talk about?" Karen began to smile. "Oh my God," she thought to herself, looking at him, knowing that he was still hurt from the cancer treatment. "This man is so determined and knows me so well. How did I get so lucky? Please, God, don't take him from us. Please let him overcome this disease." Karen thought she should give Bill a shortened version. "Bill, I screwed up. Without knowing the circumstances, I entered into a contract with a man who is connected to the mafia. His name is John Benetti, and he asked me to find a man hiding in Europe. Hank and I found it. I decided not to give the gangster information because I am sure that he will order this man to be killed. Yesterday, Benetti threatened Hannah. He said that if I didn't give him the information, Hannah would die. I gave him the report. Won't he leave Hannah alone now that he has her? Maybe. What worries me is this. He warned me that if the guy in Europe, his name is Carson, if Carson was warned, Hannah would die, but not before she is raped. So, what happens if the hitman they send fails for some reason? Benetti will blame me. And then, Karen could not finish. What are you going to do about it? Call the police? No, I want to tell Hank that asshole threatened Hannah, but I didn't want to do it without your permission. You are her father. You and I need to come to an agreement. And Hank can take care of this without it affecting us? I don't want anything to happen to Hannah, but I also don't want her, Anthony, or you to be killed by gangsters out of revenge. I'm pretty sure Hank can take care of this without anyone knowing it's connected to us. Then call Hank. Let him come." Hank had been home for 2 hours. Given the urgency of the call, his first thought was that it might be related to Bill's cancer. Hank was not a praying man, but he took a moment while driving to ask any and all higher powers to save the life of his good friend, who had played a big role in raising his daughter, a wonderful young lady. Now, sitting in their living room, Hank was unprepared for the real reason he was called to the Rowland house. When Karen repeated Benetti's threats, Bill saw something in Hank's eyes that almost scared him. That look was almost immediately replaced by what can only be described as the wheels turning in Hank's head. Hank stood up from his chair and walked into the kitchen, turned on the tap and drank straight from the tap, then returned to his chair. "I will need some computer support, but I cannot turn to anyone from the agency or company. I already have a link to John Benetti due to our initial inquiries. If there is an additional request, this Benetti will disappear and he will immediately return to us. Even if we avoid any official scrutiny, you never know where the mafia is involved. Remember that guy we helped a few years ago? Could he send viruses and take over the computer? We don't need anything so dramatic, but we do need his experience, and he is not connected to us. What was that guy's name? Jeffrey? Something like this? You're talking about Jeffrey Parker, the guy from Philadelphia. I know how to contact him, unless his contact information has changed. Hank replied, I'll call him from a phone that can't be traced to either of us and set up a meeting. From now on, none of you have anything to do with this. Karen, give me Parker's number, and I'll figure it out myself. What about Carson? I'll give him a short warning, but again, it will be impossible to track. We can't risk any of this getting to you or Hannah. 2 days later, Hank was sitting in a small Philadelphia restaurant after the lunch rush hour. There were only 2 waiters there, and 1 other table occupied, far enough from his table that they couldn't be overheard. Hank watched as Jeffrey Parker entered the restaurant, looked around, and then headed to a table. Hank stood up to greet the large man. Hello, Jeff. Thanks for meeting with me. Jeff laughed. How could I refuse? You and Karen helped save my marriage. Save? I take it you two figured it out then. Better than I could have hoped for. Emma gave birth to our first child last year, son Paul. Yes, it couldn't have been better. How is Karen? Karen is doing well, and her children are doing well, but Bill, her husband, is battling cancer. Oh, sorry. How is he doing? The doctors give us hope, but right now we have a more pressing problem and we could use your help. Hank explained the situation, what he planned to do to neutralize the threat to Hannah, and what Hank needed from Jeff to do so. Jeff sat back in his chair after Hank finished. I can do technical shit, but I have one important question. What are the chances that this will come back to haunt me? I don't want this to put me or my family in danger. Hank answered Jeff as honestly as possible. Jeff, I'm doing everything in my power to keep this away from Karen and her family as much as possible. The same goes for you and your family. There are only 2 ways to get out. Once, you'll spill the beans, or twice, I'll be caught, tortured, and I'll spill the beans. I don't think you're stupid enough to spill the beans, and I can give you 1,000,000 to 1 odds that I won't. But I know this is outside your comfort zone. All I can say is that we need your help, and you will have a friend for life. A friend you can call if you ever need special help. Jeff smiled at Hank's choice of euphemism before reaching across the table to grab Hank's hand. Tell me the name of this asshole and other details. It will take me 2 to 3 days. How can I contact you when everything is ready? Hank gave him a number to call and what to say. He shook Jeff's hand again and sincerely thanked Jeff for his help. 6,000 kilometers away, on the same day that Hank was dating Jeff, John Davis, born David Carson, and Lisa Howard were sitting in a small cafe having a delicious lunch when she decided to tease him. Davis, don't look now, but I think that guy at the bar has a crush on you. He keeps looking here, trying to pretend it's not true, but he definitely keeps looking in your direction. I'm terribly jealous. Why do the hot guys in this town always try to get you into bed and not me? David did his best to look at the man without letting on that he was looking. He immediately realized that this was not what Lisa was thinking. He saw the same guy yesterday at the market. That, coupled with the strange message he'd received 2 days ago that simply said, "Watch your back," was enough to let him know he'd been found. When he tried to call the number from which the message was sent, he received the standard response. The number you called is no longer in service. David was furious. He really liked Lisa and this city. Now both will be a thing of the past. Just when he began to relax and think that he had turned the old David Carson into a ghost. Hey, baby, let's get out of here and go to Barcelona for a couple of days. You go back to your room and pack your bag. I'll pick you up in 2 hours and we'll take the train. What do you say? What do you think? Certainly. With these words, Lisa stood up to leave the cafe. Unfortunately, Lisa couldn't help herself. When David paid the bill, Lisa stuck her tongue out at the stranger, walking past him, and said, "He's all mine." David thought he had lost the guy after spending half an hour making sure he wasn't being followed, but apparently the guy had been following him longer than he thought because when David walked into his apartment, the guy was there, in his room, and waiting. "John Bonetti wants you to know that this is from him." The stranger was holding a large knife in his hand. It was an exact replica of the knife David used to kill Joe Bonetti. What should have been an easy kill turned out to be completely wrong for a number of reasons. First, the killer had never used a knife to kill a person before. He always put a bullet in the victim's head. But John Benetti insisted on the knife. Second, David Carson had been taking self-defense classes for the past year, knowing that this day would come sooner or later, and having long ago decided that he was not the type to give up without a fight. Third, from the moment David spotted the killer, he had a small can of pepper spray ready. Before the would-be killer realized what had happened, his eyes and mouth filled with a burning liquid. David grabbed the killer's hand, which was holding a knife, but unfortunately was not fast enough to completely avoid the blade. Ignoring the pain as the knife pierced his arm, David forced the hitman to drop the knife and then applied a chokehold. Still trying to catch his breath from the pepper spray, and despite his best efforts to resist, within a minute, the killer was dead. David bandaged the wound on his arm. No stitches would be required. He then dragged the lifeless body into an empty room across the street, threw it into the bathtub, and returned to his room to pack his things. David felt like a complete asshole. He knew that Lisa would be waiting to be picked up for their trip to Barcelona. Instead, David grabbed a bag containing clothes and some personal items and walked to the bus station. He needed to pick up his stash of cash in Rome before disappearing again. Latin America held an opportunity. John Benetti was getting impatient. Yesterday, Sal called from Spain and said he found Carson. Sal would keep an eye on Carson for a couple of days to make sure nothing went wrong. But he was confident it wouldn't take more than 4 days at most. John knew he shouldn't rush Sal, but it was hard to resist telling him how to do his job. Needing to blow off some steam, John decided to pop into the Bronx and visit that brothel by the port. They had a fine selection of young girls there, and John's taste for young girls had sharpened ever since he had snatched that private detective's young daughter. He almost wished she had tried to trick him, just so she could have an excuse to pick that cherry. John thought about the girl. What was her name? Hannah. Yeah, maybe I'll just grab it anyway. John's thoughts wandered as he approached his Mercedes, not noticing the man walking along the sidewalk. Before reaching the car door, John felt the prick of a needle in his neck and felt the world plunge into darkness. It took John 4 hours to come to his senses. By then, he was hanging from a rope tied to his hands. The rope went up to a set of pulleys and down to a bar where it was tied. John's legs, thighs, and mouth were tied. John looked at the stranger in front of him. Wondering who it was, he couldn't remember anyone he had met before. His nose picked up a strange smell, and he looked down at the large bathtub he was hanging above. The stranger smiled. "Hello, John. No, you don't know me. I am Hannah's biological father. I understand that you threatened my little girl. No, don't shake your head. It's too late. Karen told me that you are going to make Hannah a woman. It won't be easy. I'm not usually an angry person. I can honestly say that I have never tortured a man before. But I think there is a first time for everything. Any sick bastard who threatens a girl deserves a slow death. The bathtub below you is filled with caustic soda, sodium hydroxide. I can see in your eyes that you have heard about it. Some of your colleagues use this to dispose of bodies." Hank unfastened the rope from the bar and lowered Benetti a few inches. Now his toes were just above the bathtub. John Benetti shook his head desperately. "How long do you think it will take you to rape my little girl? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? How long would you make her suffer before you finally killed her and put her out of her misery? I know you can't answer me, but let's just say half an hour. Just like that, damn it." Hank looked at his watch. "It's 3:30 now. Let's wait until 4 and then decide what to do next." Hank sat and read a book. John began to swing his legs, trying to move away from the bath. "Stop it, or I'll put you down right now," Hank shouted. John stopped it when he heard the threat. He still hoped the man was bluffing. Hank went back to reading his book. At 4 in the morning, Hank looked up from his book. "Well, John, have you learned your lesson? Do you promise to leave Hannah and her family alone?" John couldn't believe his ears. He nodded furiously, trying to silently assure this stranger that he would agree to his demands. But deep down, he already imagined the chaos he would wreak on that asshole. On Karin, on her family, and especially on little Hannah. You probably think I'm letting you go because I'm afraid of your mafia friends. But that's not the reason. I know about your offshore accounts, and I'm sure they know too. But if you disappear, they will ask themselves, did we know about all his accounts? It doesn't matter whether there were other accounts or not. You can't prove otherwise. So, if I wanted you to disappear, and I wanted the crowd to think that you betrayed them, I would leave a few hints here and there, like breadcrumbs. Just enough to make everyone look in the wrong direction and follow the wrong tracks. Make everyone think you escaped on your own. Anyway, this is what I would do if I was going to kill you. But I think you've learned your lesson. And as long as I have your word that you'll leave Hannah alone, you'll be free. Hank walked over to the bar and untied the rope. He pulled John up a little and stopped. I'm asking again, John. Are you willing to leave Hannah and her family alone? John nodded again, agreeing to the terms. He couldn't believe his luck. Who was this asshole? How did he find out about offshore accounts? If he was smart enough to know about these bills, why was he stupid enough to let him go? You know what, John? I do not trust you. With these words, Hank plunged Benetti into the bathtub and sealed it. Hank used a forklift to load the bathtub into the back of a pickup truck and began the long drive west, to a remote place familiar to him near the town of Lebanon. For 3 years after leaving Catalonia, David Carson moved from city to city throughout Central America and Mexico. He was currently renting a room in a villa owned by a retired lawyer near a small coastal village southwest of Ensenada. His sources in the States told him that John Benetti disappeared immediately after the assassination attempt. For at least a year after David heard the news, he was scared to death and never stayed in one city for more than a month. He suggested that John found out about the killer's death and decided to kill David himself. He didn't know that there were only 4 people in the world who knew that David had nothing to fear from John Benetti, and those 4 never even talked about it among themselves. David was walking home after another night at the local cantina. He was tired from running around, but most of all, he missed his parents and brothers and sisters. He has not met his 2 nephews who were born since he left home. Tomorrow, he will meet a guy who promised to give him a new identity. It would cost him half of the $40,000 he had left, but it would be worth every penny if he could get home. Sick bastard John Benetti fucked her like that before he disappeared. He claimed that it was revenge for the fact that his brother was killed because of her. 2 years ago, Tori spent every last penny she could scrape together and maxed out her entire credit card to get her nose fixed. But a year later, she found out that some idiot gave her gonorrhea. Now, even with the prettiest nose in town, Tori still couldn't get laid because it seemed her condition was common knowledge. What she really missed was the way David made love to her. Mom was right, she thought to herself. You never know for sure until it's all over. When she opened the door to the apartment, a shadow quickly approached her. The man pushed her inside and quickly closed the door. Don't scream, and you won't get hurt. Tori couldn't believe her eyes or ears. David? Yes, it's me. David looked around the apartment and saw desolation. I don't think anything good came out of your little affair for either of us. Tori got angry. No, David, none of us, but especially me. You didn't have to overreact and kill Joe. David was starting to lose his temper, but he needed information, so he kept his cool. I'm trying to find out what happened to John Benetti. He had a contract for me. I can't figure out what's going on with this. More than one person said you slept with him before he disappeared. What can you tell me? We didn't sleep together. He just used me like a blow-up doll. So, no. I don't know what happened to him, and I hope he rots in hell, but not before he finds and kills you for what you did to me. It was becoming increasingly difficult to remain calm, but David had another question. Any idea how John found me 3 years ago? John hired 3 different detective agencies. The latter must have found you. He didn't tell me anything. It was the Roland Agency. Some woman is leading him. On 43rd Street. If John said almost nothing, how do you know all this? Because John made me go with him. Made me say that I was looking for you so that you would know that I have your child. And you did this even though you knew John was going to kill me? John didn't give me a chance to say no. He said that if I didn't do this, he would kill me. David tied up Tori and settled in for the night. In the morning, he will go to 43rd Street and talk to this detective. Karen Roland looked up as a secretary entered her office, accompanied by a man. It was 8 in the morning, so whatever this guy wanted, it had to be urgent. A certain Mr. Jefferson. He insisted on meeting you immediately, boss. What do you want me to do? Let him in, April. I will take care of it. April left the office, but left the door open as she returned to her desk. Karen motioned for the man to sit in front of her desk. He seemed familiar. What can I do for you, Mr. Jefferson? Karen said this, hoping that the man would tell her his name to refresh her memory in case she had met him before. Sam Jefferson, I hope you can give me some information. David really didn't know how it would work. He hoped that he could find out some good news and then head back out of town. The last week had been spent reuniting with his family, but he began to worry that the police, or Benetti, would find out that he had returned to the States under a new identity. Tori was tied up in her apartment. He'll call to have her released after he's safely out of town. He almost laughed when he thought how angry the little bitch was after being tied up like 5 years ago. I need to know what happened to a man named John Benetti. I'm told he disappeared, but no one seems to know where he went. As soon as the name Benetti left the man's lips, Karen realized who was sitting in front of her. So David Carson was still alive. What a relief. Her mind didn't stop bothering her after she told Benetti Carson's location. Even Hank's contacts couldn't trace what happened. One hitman was found dead, but was there more than one? With Benetti's death, this question had not been answered until this very moment. Karen leaned back in her chair and made a decision. John Benetti is believed to have disappeared after making off with money he stole from the mafia. I can tell you what these rumors are, but they are just rumors. They say he took the money, but the mafia has no idea how much. It's a big mystery. I'll tell you what. Give me your cell number and I'll ask someone if anything else has come up. Do I owe you anything? Karen smiled slightly at the man. Sign this contract. Leave $10 and your number. That's enough. David left the detective's office. What just happened? David didn't know where his next stop would be. He hoped to learn more about Benetti to understand his options. He decided to have a cup of coffee and think. While he was sitting in Starbucks, his cell phone rang, indicating that he had received a message. You'll never have to worry about DB or the contract he made with you. David read the message twice. It was from a number that was not on the list. He decided to call the number to find out more, but after 4 rings, he heard a saved message. The number you dialed is no longer in service. Creepy shit, he thought to himself, and then smiled. David looked at the flight schedule on his phone. I think it's just my lucky day. The flight to Rome leaves in 3 hours. David made a reservation, then left Starbucks and caught a taxi. He almost said it out loud. I wonder if people in Sarajevo need any IT help. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.